Can everybody see my slides? Thank you.
Yeah.
So welcome to the second day of the JAE conference. It was good to see a lot of you at GatherTown last night, and I think we're all hoping that next year we won't be doing GatherTown again. We'll be in person next year, being in Chapel Hill. The next session is a little bit unusual in the sense that we have 3 discussants, but the editors felt like this would be a good point in the China research literature to step back and think about where the literature has been so far and where it is likely to go going forward. So the format is going to be Joanna is going to spend about 25 minutes talking through her paper, and then we'll have the 3 discussants. So Litzy Hale will go first, and then Gwen Yu, and then Chong Chen will discuss, and then Joanna will have about a minute to respond to the comments, and then it'll be open Q&A after that. And because we have sort of 4 people on the hot seat here, you should feel free to ask any of the 4 of them questions. And of course, as with all the sessions, we will have the chat box open, and Clive Lennox will be monitoring it if you want to chat as we go through the session. So take it away, Joanna.
Thank you so much, Mark, for the introduction. Clive and I would like to thank the editors for giving us the opportunity to write the survey and to present the survey at the conference. Okay, let me see. Okay, so let me give you a quick outline of the structure of the presentation today. First, I'm going to talk about the objectives of our survey, the growth and the impact of the China-related accounting research, and also why we want to study China and how we organize the survey. And we want to offer a few of the many insights from the literature, along with our cautions and questions. And importantly, we also want to touch on the issue of generalizability. And finally, I will conclude. So first, we have a number of objectives for the survey. We want to help both the China and non-China researchers to better understand the strengths and the weaknesses of the China studies and the contributions that they have made to the broader accounting literature. And also because the China setting is a little unique and it can be daunting to non-China researchers and the PhD students. So we've written the survey in a way that we want to help them better understand the distinct features of the setting and how China researchers have capitalized on those settings. And finally, we identify many opportunities for future research. So let me give you an overall picture of the growth and the impact of the China research. So far, 33 studies have been published in the 5 leading accounting journals. As you can see from this graph here, so here we plotted the average number of China studies per year. And as you can see, there is an acceleration in growth over time. So from 1996 to 2000, there was on average 1 China study per year. And this year so far, there are 12 studies that are published or forthcoming. So there's definitely a very fast and acceleration of growth in this area. We also compare the citation counts of the China papers with the non-China papers, or we should say the much larger population of all studies. And we find that the average and the median China paper is in the top 32 and 23% of the annual citation count distribution of all the papers published in these 5 journals from 1997, which was when the first China paper was published, until last year. We excluded this year because we need time for papers to accumulate citations. So basically what we see here is that the China papers have made a meaningful impact on the broader literature. So why do we study China? Well, why is it worthwhile to study China? China is a highly significant player in the global economy, which means it is deserving of attention in its own right. China has grown at over 9% per year for over 4 decades. It's the second largest economy. It has the second largest stock market We can just go through more statistics, but we all know how significant the country is on the global stage. Now, another reason why we care about China is events in China can produce significant spillovers elsewhere in the world. One example is China's domestic stock market listing process, which is very lengthy and unpredictable and politically sensitive, which has caused many high-growth Chinese firms to seek listings overseas. Other examples include the recent government actions involving overseas listed Chinese companies. For example, Ant Group's Hong Kong IPO that was canceled the last minute by the Chinese regulators, and the sanctions on Didi, which is China's Uber, within a week after its listing on the New York Stock Exchange, and also the recent crackdown on the variable interest entity corporate structure, which is a very popular vehicle used by many overseas Chinese companies to circumvent the Chinese government's restrictions on foreign ownership. So these actions obviously have had large ramifications for foreign investors, including US investors. Now, importantly, China is also important because its distinctive institutional features can add new dimensions to our understanding of various economic phenomena, especially when there are theoretical reasons to believe that economic phenomena is contingent upon the country's institutional features. For example, recent theoretical work by Schantel and Weigenhofer, they argue that the relationship between financial misreporting and public enforcement depends on the strength of the private litigation regime. So what it means is that relationship that you observe in a country such as the US may not extend to a setting where the threat of civil litigation is low, such as in China. Now, China also upends many conventional wisdoms. For example, the notion that economic growth depends on strong institutions. We know China has grown phenomenally fast over a long period of time, despite having weak institutions. So China really pushes the boundary of our understanding of economic phenomena. It pushes the boundaries of existing theory. And that is another reason why it is important to look at China. Now, also, China is interesting because it offers many unique and interesting regulatory experiments and data. For example, investor interactive platforms that we saw yesterday. So the paper yesterday on investor communications is an excellent example of the opportunities that are existing in China. So the China studies cover a broad spectrum of research questions. At one end of the spectrum, you have more China-specific studies where the research questions are deeply rooted to the country's institutions. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have papers that are less specific to China. And China is basically used as a setting, perhaps because of its novel data, to answer a broader research question. Now, this is a continuum, and there's no clear dividing line, but we feel that this is an interesting and useful way to look at the literature. The central theme that connects all these different topics is the key role of China's institutions. And institutional knowledge is important even for the less China-specific studies, because you need the institutional understanding to be able to properly interpret the findings and to be able to assess the generalizability of the findings. So we organized the survey around 3 different but also interconnected themes. In section 2, we look at the political and regulatory forces in China. And then we look at China's relations with foreign investors. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have section 4, where we look at the novel data and regulatory shocks and how researchers have used those to draw inferences and answer questions that are impossible or difficult to answer from other settings. Now, the China survey spans many different topics, which reflects the heterogeneous nature of the literature. So we are not going to go over every topic area in the presentation, obviously today. So we're going to highlight a few things that we find that are the most interesting and perhaps important in our view. So first, we're going to touch on the role of state ownership and how it shapes agency conflicts and accounting attributes. And also, we look into why do Chinese firms seek US listings? Is there an individual auditor effect in audit quality? And the challenges when study regulatory shocks in China. So first, state ownership. High ownership concentration is characteristic of nearly all listed firms in China. Now, when you have a non-state-owned firm, you have these controlling shareholders and minority shareholders, and high ownership concentration creates agency conflicts between the controlling shareholders and the minority shareholders. And accounting opacity is typically viewed as a tool used by the controlling shareholders to camouflage their rent extraction. Now, when you have the state as the controlling shareholder, the nature and the degree of the agency conflict change, and as do the accounting implications. And this is because the state not only pursues commercial goals, but also it pursues social and political objectives. And the pursuit of the social and political objectives might be detrimental to the minority shareholders, but by the same time, the minority shareholders could also potentially benefit from state support. Now, there's interesting evidence from China that the SOEs have less asset tunneling and less perk consumption by insiders compared with non-SOEs. Now, typically, you would expect a positive relation between rent extraction and accounting opacity. But in the case of China, the SOEs have lower accounting transparency. So that points to potentially other reasons than camouflaging rent extraction for accounting opacity. For example, maybe there's a lower demand for accounting information for SOEs. Now, another interesting question is whether SOEs have less need to camouflage their rent extraction through accounting opacity. For example, some of the rent extraction activities may be done out in the open if these are for the purpose of pursuing, say, social objectives, and especially also if the firm is expecting reciprocal support from the state. So what we see here is that the existence of the state as the controlling shareholder, it really changes the nature and the degree of the agency conflict, and it also changes the relationship between agency conflict and accounting attributes. Now, China accounts for a large proportion of foreign companies listed in the US. Some of them are organized as reverse mergers. So these were very popular in the 2000s. So from 2000 to 2011, the Chinese reverse mergers accounted for 85% of all overseas reverse mergers in the US. In the early 2010s, these Chinese reverse mergers were embroiled in a wave of accounting scandals. So that dampened the popularity of reverse mergers as a way for Chinese firms to become listed in the US. At the same time, the Chinese IPOs have remained highly significant. For example, Alibaba's IPO on the New York Stock Exchange, I believe it still holds the record as the largest IPO in US history. And despite recent US-China tensions, 30 Chinese companies have IPO'd in the US last year, which accounted for close to 60% of all overseas IPOs in the US. And as of May of this year, there were close to 250 Chinese companies listed on the major US exchanges with a combined market cap of over $2 trillion. Of course, these companies have recently been at the crosshairs of the regulatory and the political authorities in both countries. And the actions taken by both countries have had a large impact on both the Chinese companies and also US investors. The important question is what factors motivate Chinese companies to access the US market? Now, the literature has generally concluded that the Chinese IPOs are motivated to bond with US institutions, whereas the Chinese reverse mergers reflect an adverse selection, which means these are low quality firms that are taking advantage of the opaque reverse merger process. Now, that conclusion in the literature is largely based on the evidence that the Chinese reverse mergers have weaker governance traits compared with the Chinese IPOs. Now, we believe that the conclusion that the Chinese reverse mergers lack bonding motives may be premature because these firms are much smaller and less profitable and more financially constrained than the Chinese IPOs. And so they're generally ineligible for an IPO. So it may not be that they have chosen reverse mergers, a reverse merger process to remain opaque. And also it is notoriously difficult to define what is good governance. So what appears to be weak governance traits could be optimal for these firms, especially given their small size. And also Chinese reverse mergers have been shown to have stronger operating performances than the Chinese domestic IPOs. So this evidence also casts out on the conclusion that these are low quality firms on average that are taking advantage of the opaque reverse merger process. Now, even though we question the conclusion that the Chinese reverse mergers are devoid of bonding motivation, at the same time, we also raise the question as to the relative significance of bonding incentives compared to other considerations. Capital access is a very important consideration because these companies, they're typically not qualified to become listed by COM in China. To diversify investor base is another important reason. Visibility and prestige, always very important considerations culturally. And also it could be done for the purpose of circumventing the country's tight capital control by the insiders and for the insiders to move money more easily out of the country. So these other considerations could be just as important or even more important than the bonding motivations. Another important question is how does bonding actually work within the context of China's institutional arrangements? For example, a lot of these overseas listed Chinese companies, including Alibaba, they are organized using the VIE corporate structure, in which essentially the foreign investors do not have direct ownership in the underlying business. So that raises the question as to how does the bonding mechanism actually work and how effective it would be. So these are important questions, obviously, for US investors, regulators, and researchers alike. Now, China has turned out to be a very appealing setting for auditing research, in part because of a lot of novel data coming out of China. For example, the identities of signatory auditors, year-end audit adjustments, and the equity ownership stakes of individual auditors. And one of the questions that the literature has sought to answer is if there's an individual auditor effect in audit quality. Now, the answer coming out of the China study is an affirmative one. The papers, the China literature finds that the properties of financial reporting are clustered around the clients of a given signatory auditor, which is consistent with the presence of individual auditor effect. Now, there are some limitations to this literature, to the conclusions. First, the disclosure of the identity of the signatory auditor presumably could change that person's behavior. So one may behave more ethically or more diligently if your name is out in the public domain. So it may not generalize to a setting where the information remain undisclosed. And also the individual auditor effect may still reflect a client selection effect because the auditor assignment is not random. And recently the PCAOB is starting to provide similar data on signatory auditors' identities. So that reduces the novelty of data coming out of China. Some challenges when studying regulatory shocks in China. So here I'm going to give you three regulatory reforms that are related to corporate governance as an illustration. So in 2004, China introduced the segmented voting reform, which requires major corporate decisions to receive separate voting approval from minority shareholders. And then in 2005, China introduced the split share structure reform, which allowed the previously non-treatable shares to become treatable. So the non-treatable shares were mostly state shares held in the ISOEs and the founder shares in non-ISOEs. After the reform, they become treatable on the open market. And in 2007, China launched the enforcement campaign for its Code of Corporate Governance. Now, the three regulatory initiatives are in close succession with each other, as you can see. And they also share a common objective, which is to improve corporate governance. When you look into the studies in the literature, each individual shock is viewed as an individual event in isolation, essentially. But given the clustered nature of these events, it would be challenging to clearly attribute the observed outcomes to a specific event. And this is not something that is specific to just these three particular regulatory reforms. We provide a timeline in the paper in the appendix. You can see many reforms that are in close succession or in conjunction with other reforms. So that really makes it challenging to attribute inferences clearly to an individual shock. So extra care would be needed in the literature to draw clear inferences. And some other challenges, oftentimes our regulations are applied to each and every listed firm, so there is no natural control group. And some of these regulations are also could be anticipated in advance. For example, the split share structure reform was preceded by the government's multiple attempts to sell non-treatable shares before 2005. Now, we are not saying that these challenges are unique to the China literature. However, some of these challenges are perhaps exacerbated in the China setting, especially given how active the government's reform agenda has been. Now, we want to talk about the issue of generalizability, and this has come up yesterday as well. When we were in the investor communications papers session. So the nature of the question is a little bit different for papers that are more China-centric and the papers that are less China-specific. So we're going to talk about them separately. So for the more China-centric papers, obviously a lot of these papers, they're looking at situations in China, and the aim is not so much to generalize to other settings. And as we mentioned previously, we view these papers as important, just given the significance of the setting of China. And also, we also touched on the advantage of having a diverse collection of institutional settings to advance our knowledge and to add to our expand our existing theories. At the same time, we do believe, and even the China-specific studies can speak to more general settings. And this is because China's institutional features do share similarities with many other countries. For example, state ownership is important in China, but it is also quite common around the world. A recent paper by Amanadov and Papiano, they look at 100 countries, a very large sample. And what they find is that the government controls close to 5% of the listed firms, which accounts for about 14% of the market cap, because the ISOEs tend to be larger firms. And also government ownership tends to be in strategic industries that the rest of the economy depends on. And furthermore, even in the US, we see government ownership, especially after the financial crisis. And obviously, China also shares many similarities with other emerging economies and with insider economies. For example, high ownership concentration, very common in continental Europe, in Asia, low risk of civil litigation. Here, in fact, the US is a kind of an outlier because of its high litigation risk. And the prevalence of social connections and related party transactions is by no means unique to China. Now, arguably, the concern about generalizability is more of an issue for less China-specific studies, because by nature, these studies try to draw broader inferences. We have a few observations here. First, most studies locate their research in China because the data and the regulatory shocks are not available elsewhere. So the researcher faces essentially two choices. One is to abandon the research question altogether for fear of lack of generalizability, or to pursue the research question knowing that generalizability could become an issue. The downside of the abandonment approach is that the literature may become stagnant and over time become overly focused on a narrow set of research questions. So weighing the pros and cons, we still feel that it would be worthwhile to pursue these questions. And hopefully that generalizability will become less of a concern as data become more available elsewhere. And we also want to point out the assessment of generalizability depends on the theory being tested. For some studies, there are theoretical reasons to believe that the predictions are contingent upon the underlying institutions. Well, that may not be the case for other studies. So we caution against the blanket labeling of China research as either lacking in generalizability or yielding generalizable insights. We also propose ways to mitigate generalizability concerns in the survey. In the interest of time, I will not go over those here. And also China is developing and it is sharing more traits with more developed countries over time. Let me just quickly give you some numbers here. State-owned enterprises in 1999, over 80% of the firms were ISO East. Nowadays it's under 30%. Information intermediaries are becoming more important over time as well, as you can see here. Now, let me just quickly conclude. China studies comprises many research objectives and topics, and they have contributed to our understanding about China and also to about a wide range of non-China specific research questions. The two directions of China research, the more China-centric direction and the less China-specific direction, both are promising, and we look forward to more research in both of these areas. And with that, thank you so much, and we look forward to the panel discussion.
So Lutzi Hale will be the first discussant.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are sitting. I think first, in the name of all three of us, I would like to thank the JAE editors for giving us the opportunity to present this work and share our own views. Now, given that we are three discussants or panelists, we thought, oh, we probably should do some coordination, because else we all would end up with the three main issues, and that would be kind of repetitive. So Gwen, Jiang, and me, we agreed on the following division of labor. I will start off with offering a few thoughts on the historical perspective of why has China research become so successful over the years. Then Gwen will offer her insights on the current state of the China research, and Jiang finally will conclude with offering a few thoughts on how to successfully conduct China research and what the future might hold. Now, given that I'm the only one with absolutely no experience in doing China research, I think my role here is primarily one of the devil's advocate, whereas Gwen and Jiang, they're more invested in the area, so they will be the good type. Now, before I start, a quick shout out to Alex Coble, who is one of our PhD students who helped me put together the data for my talk. So let's start with the first pressing question first. Why does the JAE commission a China survey? And the answer is, I think, quite obvious if you look at it from a market perspective. Where there is a demand, there is a supply. And indeed, there are many accounting scholars working on China-related topics and many readers interested in these studies. So it's not surprising that an outlet like JAE takes this opportunity to put together a view of the extant body of literature so that future generations of scholars and PhDs can build on it. And as a nice side effect also that this can generate some citations in the future going down. But China offers also quite a few unique features, and Joanna in her talk mentioned essentially all of them. So the typical arguments you often hear is, oh, China is a big economy. They have unique data. There are many regulatory changes. And it's one of those countries with strong informal institutions. And these are all valid arguments. But I think I also observed a more subtle change in the paradigm of what accounting research is over the last couple of years. So accounting research used to be and still is very US-centric. So for someone who does international research like myself, the first question always is, oh, why don't you use US data for your analysis? However, I observed that there are more international papers showing up in our top tier outlets. So there has been a shift to being more open to other institutions in institutional settings around the world. And it almost looks like as China has become an independent area of studies. So if I nowadays had to characterize international research, I'm tempted to say, oh, we have China research and then there is the rest. However, is it really true that what I call China research, and when I use this expression, I always refer to China-related accounting studies, is it really comparable to other areas of studies like literature on financial analysts or auditing or executive compensation? Because notably enough, it is primarily defined by geographic area and not by topic of interest. And if you look around, nowhere else do we see such a definition of research based on geographic area. So I doubt that the JAE would consider publishing a survey on European research, even though it also offers unique data, many regulatory changes, and I think arguably has economic importance. Or to point it even further, I doubt that there ever will be a survey in JAE about the Swiss accounting research. Now, let's look at the different forces that shape the demand and supply for China research. And we start with the supply side. So there indeed has been a growing trend in China studies over the years. So the red columns are the China papers that we identified over the last 20 years, which is essentially the time period that the survey covers. And as a comparison, I also plotted here the international accounting studies, and in both you can see there is a market trend upwards over time. However, if we put this into context and ask ourselves, is China research really that special? Then the answer is probably more subtle. So if we look at the composition of international research over time, then by far the most important area of international research are cross-country studies. And we have seen one example yesterday with Anya's and Mark's and Doug's paper, where they really try to look at differences across countries, which to me is true international research. Now, by definition, this excludes those single country studies like China research. Now, another important area of international research over the last 20 years was IFRS research, which during its heydays in the mid-2000s and early 2010s made up the majority of international research. Now there, the interesting part is that it's defined by topic, by, let's say, economic concept, whereas when it comes to China research, it is again defined by geography. And if we apply the same concept to studies, let's say from the European Union, be it single country or multi-country studies, then you can quickly see from the graph that European studies in terms of output make up about the same amount as China studies. But here we have to be careful, because if we take a step back, then international research is only a small sliver of our overall output. And overall, they only make up for about 10% of all the research we produce in our top outlets. Then let's look at the demand side. Also on the demand side, we have observed a market increase in, here measured as citations, of China research. So here what I'm plotting is the total citations as well as the annual citations as of the year of publication. And you see there is an increasing trend, in particular when it comes to annual citations. But again, if we put this into perspective, is China research really more impactful than other areas of research? So in this graph here, what I did is I looked at the top 500 articles in terms of annual citations out of all the top 5 publications and ranked them by most impactful to less impactful. But again, these are the most impactful papers to begin with. And it is indeed true, there are a couple of China papers in this highly selective group that have a huge impact on the area. But they are not the only ones when it comes to international papers. So, for example, papers that look at things in the European Union are have been equally successful, as you could see by the squares in this graph. Or if, again, you look at the IFRS research, then we see even more papers that have an impact had in the community. Now, here again, we have to be careful and try to not lose the big picture out of sight, because the typical 10 to 50% rule applies to China research as well, which means that only about 10% of all the publications garner more than 50% of the citations. And this applies to China research, international research, accounting research in general, which means that there is a large fraction of papers out there that unfortunately go pretty much unnoticed. Which then leads to the typical researcher's dilemma: how, if we only knew what a paper will become successful, and hopefully Gwen and Zhang will be able to shed some light on that, so that we can see more China-related papers marching into this highly impactful area. Let's look at another dimension of the demand side, the readers. And the way I measure that is by the numbers of downloads here in terms of downloads from JAR articles from the Wiley website in 2020. And indeed, the second largest country in terms of downloads is China, which means that there are many readers in that area interested in our research. Which then begs the question, is China research maybe self-reinforcing? Because if you look closer of who writes the China papers, then not surprisingly, about 2/3 of the China papers are written by scholars whose affiliation is either directly in China or in Hong Kong or Singapore. So who have some roots in the area, which to me makes complete sense, because they have the institutional knowledge, they do have the access to the data. But at the same time, we probably should ask ourselves, what if they lose the forest for the trees? So it would maybe be helpful if sometimes they take on a different perspective in terms of making their papers more impactful. Now, this issue comes even more out when we focus on who cites the China papers. More than half of the citations are in other China papers. And this is a phenomenon that is very common to us accountants, that we accountants like to look outwards. We go out of our way to cite papers in econ, in finance, but if you look the other way around, they hardly ever notice us. And this is particularly pronounced for the China papers as well. So the scope here clearly should be to broaden up the slice of US studies or non-China related researchers that find an interest in those papers. Now, let me skip the next 2 slides and move directly to the alleged contribution that most of those China papers make. And fairly quickly, there are 4 major themes that arise. And these are overlapping, so they are not exclusive. But many of those studies argue that, we provide unique data and have a unique setting. And the same holds for studies that argue, we have a regulatory change that allow us for a better, tighter identification. And I agree, these are valid points that you can use to motivate a study, but to me, they are in no way specific to China, because you will find better data, regulatory changes, and unique settings all over the world. So I think this is good, but in that sense, we should broaden our perspective and allow more international research to enter our space with these kind of reasons. Then the biggest piece of the pie makes up contributions that are based on the argument, oh, China is important. And Joanna also made this point before when she motivated her survey, and agree. And again, I agree, this is a valid statement, but here I think we have to be a little bit more nuanced, because I would differentiate between China is important and China is different. China is important to me by itself isn't that much of a validation for a valid contribution in the literature, because again, I hardly have seen studies from Spain or from Switzerland making the argument, oh, Switzerland is important, so that's why we contribute to the accounting research. However, when it comes to China is different, then I think China has many things to offer, because it offers the informational structure, it has the strong political influence on how the markets and how the economy works. In that sense, it offers unique insights. And those are the ones I truly validate as unique contributions in that area. And finally, we have the contributions where China Research tries to contribute to the general, to some general economic insight. Again, I think this slice of the pie should become bigger. So it should be the intention of China researchers to speak to the non-China researcher community to have a more of an impact. And I think most of the high impact papers fall exactly in that category. Which brings me to the insights that we have gained so far.
Could you end fairly quickly?
Four insights. China research is here to stay. The definition of China research by geographic area is fairly unusual. I recommend that China research focus on the specialness and not the features that are similar to other areas. And I recommend that they broaden their appeal to non-China researchers. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Gwen.
So Gwen, you will be next.
Thank you. Did the slide share work?
Yep.
Yeah, wonderful. All right. Well, thank you, Mark, and also the editors for the opportunity. And also for Lucy and Jiang for being such great collaborators on this discussion. By no means would I call myself a China expert. In fact, even for this discussion, I had to actually reach out to one of my co-authors to fact check some of the institutional details. So a big shout out to Shubo Jiang at CUHK for helping me with that. I believe the editors viewed me as a middleman or a middlewoman on this panel, someone who started her career looking at international studies, but slowly ventured into studies using settings outside the US, including but not limited to China. So that mezzanine role is the role I will play on this panel. I will pick up from where Lucy left off. He nicely placed China research in the broader context of the international literature. I will focus on the current state of China research using the author's framework as a guide and highlight some of the challenges and opportunities. So first of all, let me first start out by thanking the authors for providing this timely, informative review. As they bring up in the review, there has been an exponential growth recently in China studies published in top accounting journals. And the review not only provides an excellent summary of all the studies, but also it discusses a lot of the features of the new data and regulatory reforms that China undertook that really helps lower the entry barrier into China research for emerging scholars. Now, what I want to emphasize, as Lucy touched upon this, is that it is a very unique review in the sense that it covers a wide range of topics. Typically, reviews focus on one topical area, such as disclosure or specific methods, as we saw yesterday. This covers everything under all topics that use a China setting. So even though the number of studies may seem like a lot, once you go into each topical area, it's actually sparsely populated. For example, we only see a handful of managerial, tax, or corporate governance studies. Audit studies, on the other hand, seem slightly overrepresented, taking up about 35% of China studies. And I believe this pattern actually reflects the early stage of the literature, but also how the literature has evolved, which was with the objective to incrementally contribute to a paradigm that was dominated by US. So if you look at a lot of China studies, what happens is they're often trying to make an incremental contribution over existing studies. And what this often means is rather than start from the beginning and understand China as a whole pie, instead you focus on some parts that actually are different from the US in order to make a contribution. Actually reminds me of the find the differences in the two pictures game that my daughter likes to play. You actually focus on small differences in a setting that may seem identical otherwise. And in this picture, the color of the fish looks different and hence becomes the main focus of the study. However, if you understand the broader context of things, the color of the fish may be the last thing the red fish needs to worry about. And the challenge the China studies face is finding that main force that defines the shark, which can represent political climate or informal institutions, and make that the main focus of the study. Let me next move on to the author's framework. They provide an intuitive framework in organizing China studies. It's one of those frameworks where you look at it and you start nodding your head, that makes sense. But I'm sure coming up with it would have been a non-trivial exercise. So the studies are organized based on the type of research questions asked, whether it's a China-specific or a non-China-specific question. And in doing so, the review quite naturally lends itself to this tension around generalizability issues that emerges as a key theme throughout the review. And as Joanna mentioned, the classification is by no means binary, and I completely agree. Many China studies, including my own, really strive to strike this balance. And the more you try to extend your contribution, claiming that it is applicable to a non-China setting, the higher the bar becomes to be able to generalize your study's findings. Actually, early studies tend to focus more on China-specific issues, such as government ownership and SOEs. But surprisingly, less than half of all China studies fall into that category. And we see an increasing trend where studies are slowly moving, claiming that they are looking at non-China specific questions, as you see in the blue shaded area. So more and more studies are claiming to be using China only as a setting to answer a more general question. And China becomes a setting because either unique data makes things observable or unique regulatory changes happen, make things identifiable. And indeed, there are a lot of regulatory reforms happening in China. But one has to ask, the sheer fact that we're observing so many unique regulatory changes is worth thinking about. Why does the Chinese government like to experiment so heavily on its capital markets? And then where on earth do they come up with these ideas? So new policies in China actually emerged through a process called what is known as policy experimentations. And this idea of policy experimentations actually dates back from the days of Deng Xiaoping, when China was thinking about how it would open up its controlled economy to a more market-based system. Now, when deciding which policies to implement, what happens is the central government first experiment in some selected regions, and successful ones become policies at the national level. And in fact, a recent study done by Harvard economists shows that there is actually a large increase in policy experimentations conducted by the central government in recent years. Now, what is interesting is that that increase actually parallels the increase in the number of China studies published in top publication outlets, perhaps because researchers actually like to use these policies as regulatory shocks to better identify causal effects. Now, what I want to highlight, though, is that there is an interesting political economy behind these policy experimentations. First, the choice of where the government first decides to experiment is driven by political incentives, typically to favor more of the developed regions like the Guangdong, and which means that the eventual policies that get implemented at the national level is more likely to be tailored to these richer regions and benefit them the most. Actually reminds me of my consulting days where you know exactly what policies you want to recommend and implement the pilots in parts of the firm that you know you will succeed. Now, what does that mean? Well, for researchers, there are few broad implications for using these experimentations as random shots. First, what we observe policies at the national level, is a product of a very careful selection process controlled by the government. And even for staggered adoption, which we like to use for a definitive test at the regional level, it's hard to consider these as a random rollout process. And finally, the unique data that may actually be released and become available from these regulations, their release may actually be driven by political incentives to promote the effectiveness of the regulation. So if the goal is to search for randomness in regulatory shots, China probably is not the best place to look. And the true value of these regulatory reforms may come from its unique features rather than its empirical appeal from an identification standpoint. And we should use them with a good understanding of these incentives. So if we're not going to get very far using China as a setting for identification, then where are some of the key opportunities? And how can China studies appeal to a broader audience who may be actually skeptical about its generalizability? And I know there are many. And the authors claim that if China becomes more converged with the rest of the world, it may become easier to generalize some of the findings. It's probably the only statement in the review that I slightly disagree with. As researchers, we try to exploit differences and variations rather than eliminate them. And if China indeed becomes very similar to the US or the rest of the world, which I doubt will happen, then I doubt also we will see similar growth in China studies that we're seeing right now. So future opportunities may lie simply in embracing the fact that China is different. And perhaps a different way of thinking about generalizability is thinking of China as another extreme observation. In fact, there's actually a similar argument in the legal literature that US is an outlier when it comes to enforcement activities. And for China, on the one hand, it's an odd observation because much of our existing theory is based on US institutions. But on the other hand, it may actually offer fascinating grounds to test the boundaries of these theories. And so why not use it as an opportunity to spell out the constraints and conditions and identify some of the nonlinearities and countervailing forces, which may in turn come back to recalibrate our existing theories. Joanna mentioned a good example during her presentation, the Scantlin and Waganofer paper, which I won't go through the details, but the basic idea there is you can use US and China as two extreme observations when it comes to private litigation environments. Yesterday, we also saw from Charles Lee's paper that China's capital market is dominated by retail investors. In a market where more than 85% of investors are retail investors, what would be the role of information? And how would disclosure incentive change? Would all be interesting questions to ask. So while I provided a summary of the challenges and some opportunities, actually, this is not to say China research has not made progress in the last 25 years. We have gained many insights, and authors have provided their own, focusing on the audit market and the cross-listing literature. I'd like to offer a few more for those who are less familiar with China research. So what have we learned? We learned that political forces have strong influence on economic outcomes. As Joanna mentioned, SOEs behave very differently from non-SOEs, but even for non-SOEs, much of their behavior is driven by the need to please the government. Second, informal institutions matter. Relationships form a strong basis for contracting, and social ties can also be an important channel of economic activities. And this may be the reason that individual fixed effects in the audit market matter so much in China, because of the relationships they carry. And finally, the market process has been characterized by this constant struggle or balancing act between government control and market forces. As was mentioned in the fact, the red line that Charles Lee mentioned always seems to be moving. And that has been characterizing the market reforms that China has been undertaking. And a final note, if you look at the list, you can see that easily a lot of these insights could be applicable to US settings or other developing economies. And this is why I think there may be something that everyone can learn from China research. And Chiang will tell us a little bit more about how we can do that and how China can expand its impact on its research. Thank you.
Next discussant is Chang Chen.
Thank you, Mark. Let me get my slides in. Is the slide showing well? Okay, so I'm picking up what Lucy and Gun left, but like them, I want to thank JAE editors for inviting us to discuss this review. And Clive shared the working paper version, earlier working paper version with me. I really like it. I think that this is a very comprehensive review. I think this is a must read for anybody who is interested in China-related research, and definitely a great read for anybody who is doing China-related research. So in my part, the assignment to me is to discuss about the China-related research from more the author's perspective or the person who are interested in China-related research's perspective. So I will discuss two things. The first one is when we conduct the China-related research, what issues or what things we need to take into consideration so that the research can be more impactful. The second one is what will be the opportunities for future research. Joanna and Clive discuss a lot about the future research when they discuss the specific area, which I find very, very informative. But I would encourage the authors to discuss a little bit more toward the end of the paper and give the readers some general idea where the future research should go. Here, I will just share some of my thoughts. First, when we conduct China-related research or conduct any research, we need to think about the audience and think about what the audience wants to learn. And if we think about the China-related research, we can generally think about the two groups of audience. The first group will be the scholars who conduct China-related research. And of course, those people want to know what prior research has documented and what's the incremental contribution the current paper is adding. And the second group is actually the scholars who don't conduct the China-related research, but naturally have very little knowledge about China. And that's actually where most of China-related researchers focus their attention on, because this is where the hurdle is. The hurdle is coming from the lack of understanding of the institutional background of the readers. And the second one is to say the research, as Lucy and Gwen point out, many times they don't find the China-related research is beneficial to their own research. So the intention or the incentives to read China-related research is relatively low. And of course, here we have the big why China question, and every paper on China will have to answer why China, just like what Lucy pointed out. If you conduct an international study, there will be a question, why international, why not US? I think this reflects a little bit bias in this field that everything is US-centric. If it's not US, we have to ask why not US? And this is the citations of one paper, Wang et al., published in 2018 on state ownership. So here, what we can see is that to say whether it's this is the citation of Wang, which is one of the most cited papers in China-related research. Whether it's accounting or finance or management, which cites Wang et al., we notice that the majority of the citation is coming from China-related research. Lucy has a similar view in one of his slides. So here, the implication will be that the majority of the studies that cite China-related research are China-related research. And to me, that's a sad fact in the sense that China-related research is almost like a bubble itself that we develop on each other, but we don't really reach out. When we want to reach out, that's the blue line or the green line. So that's where the non-China related research cites China related research. So that means, say, for those citations where we see China related research will contribute to areas which is not China centric. So when we want to increase the contribution of the papers, we need to think whether we add anything that is beyond China. This is not to say that the contribution to China research is not important. It's just that if we want to broaden the impact, we need to think about non-China related research. And the second issue we need to think about is to say what the audience hope to learn. And this has been discussed quite a number of times to say for China-centric question. And fundamentally it's about that China is important. So that's, if we look at the economics, and we will see a lot of papers on China, we will notice a lot of papers on Japan. It's not because, say, those studies offer some unique sites beyond what we can learn from US. It's just because China is important, Japan is important, EU is important, so we want to understand that economy. And then, of course, the broader question is the second one, say we use China data, where the data is very unique from, and we want to answer some of the broad questions. So here the insights can shed light on which the other research cannot provide. So for example, Joanna mentioned about the auditor's signature, and there are also a lot of papers on analyst incentives. And the third one is China provided a more powerful setting, which of course you can do similar research using another setting, but to say that setting might not provide you a powerful setting either because, say, the variation is relatively low, for example, state ownership, or the ownership structure is less prevalent, or the economic reforms, say, they are less impactful. So this is the rank of all the China-related papers based on the citations. So here we can see the outlier, Wang et al., which has a lot of citations. And then we have some of the papers which are also well cited. And then the majority of the papers are just have very little citations. This is not unique to China-related research. This is actually a very general phenomenon. If you think about any area of research, you will see similar graph. The majority of the papers have very little impact, and a very handful of the papers will get the most of the attentions. Lucy mentioned the 1050. I will use a 2080. 20% of the papers get 80% of the citations. But what we can learn from this picture is to say, if we want to increase the citations, which is essentially a measure of the impact, we need to think about to say, what kind of papers will get that impact, will receive that impact, will be cited. So if we look at the papers, we will notice that most of the well-cited papers are not about the China-centric papers. They're actually the papers, the second group of the papers based on Joanna and Clive's classification, where the papers answer the general questions, but using China data because that's where the data is only available, just like the auditor's signature. And so from all those graphs, I will highlight the following. So if we want to increase the impact of the paper, we need to think about the key insights that are not restricted to China. Here, just some of the examples: the impact of a state ownership, as in Wang et al., the impact of a disclosure requirement on ESG, which is a more recent paper, that's Ching et al., 2018, and the corporate governance role of social media, which is forthcoming at TAR, that's and et al. 2021. So that's where the impact of a China-related research will be greater because the phenomenon the papers are looking at is not China-centric. And a similar view is that the insights should also be useful to US research because the majority of the readers and the majority of the authors are still US based. So we have to think about to say, what's the impact of those China-related research to those readers, to those audience. This is the last slide on topic 3. So here I graph the citations of 2 papers, Wang et al. 2018 and Ching et al. 2018, Wang et al. 2008. So here I look at the where the citations are coming from, the field, whether it's cited by accounting research or finance research or econ research or management, or whether it's accounting, finance, management, or sustainability, because Ching et al. Is focusing on social responsibility of corporations. So here I will call on all accounting researchers. So Lucy made this point to say, we tend to be consumers of other research. We cite a lot of econ papers, we cite a lot of accounting finance papers, but as accounting research, researchers, if we want to make an impact on others, we need to think about the citations or the impact on areas other than accounting. Chen et al. 2018 will be a great example where the majority of the citations is coming from non-accounting research. That means a lot of other areas, so whether it's management, finance, or sustainability, they also look at the accounting researchers to get some insights. That will bring me to the last point of our discussions about opportunities for future research. Anytime we provide opportunities for future research, sometimes I will say we are not providing wholeheartedly because we don't know what will be the opportunities for future research. If the opportunity is so great, we will not share that. We will just keep that for ourselves and to conduct the research ourselves. But here we're just to make an attempt to provide some areas where the future research can provide some insights. This is the area where Joanna discussed quite a bit in terms of listing of China companies in the US. But here I will point out the recent phenomenon where the security regulation is we have political forces on the security regulations, which I will call a politicization of securities regulation. This comes from two sides. One is the US side. The PCLB wants to see the audit book of US listed Chinese companies, which just don't want to open the book because of the state secrets. But with the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, if the Chinese companies don't open their book, and then they will be kicked out of the US exchanges. And then the second force is coming from China itself, because the Chinese government doesn't really want to see a lot of companies listed in the US, because the companies listed in the US, especially in the recent years, are the fantastic companies. That's where the growth is coming from, whether it's Alibaba or Didi. So I don't know what will be happening after, say, 2022, when the deadline imposed by US is coming to the close. But I think that will be a great area to look at. Essentially, this is about the cross-listed firms and the information symmetry and the disciplining of foreign companies listed in the US. The second area which I find will be important in the future is the growth of a digital economy, and this is not area that is specific about China, but here we will just use China as an example. Say, given the growth of a digital economy, data will be very important assets for all the companies using internet or other fintech. So the valuation of data will be a very important issue for the valuation of all those companies. The second area will be the impact of regulation on digital economy. We can see that there have been a lot of discussions in the US, there have been a lot of discussion in China as well as in other countries. So how those regulations affect the digital economy will be an interesting phenomenon to examine. The third area will be the use of analytics by regulators. We have seen some anecdotal evidence where the regulators use analytics to detect frauds. Regulators use analytics to detect insider trading. It will be very interesting to see how the use of analytics by regulators affect the phenomenon that we are interested in, whether it's fraud detection or insider trading or other area. The last area in this general category will be fintech lending, which is growing very quickly in China, and I think as well as in other countries, probably more in China. So there have been some papers looking at the trade-off between data, where fintech use data to evaluate the creditworthiness of the borrowers, and the traditional lending is using collateral to reduce the risk. It will be interesting to see more papers on how the fintech lending is complementing the traditional lending, and how fintech lending is competing with the traditional lending, and how fintech lending is affecting the debt contract. The last area which I will see, I will hope to see more papers is on the new data coming from the applications of a new technology, whether it's a blockchain or machine learning. So here I would just mention two examples of the studies. I'm working on a paper on economic value of blockchain applications. We're all interested in blockchain application, not just because Bitcoin is very valuable, but blockchain is used by companies in many areas, but there's no data, and it's also an early stage of blockchain applications. So we're examining in one setting, the asset-backed security setting, to see what is the value added by blockchain applications. Liu 2020 is looking at human versus machine in lending discussion. So here he is looking at information used by human debt officers and loan officers versus machines, which is using all available data to decide whether to provide loans to the borrowers. So I hope to see more papers in these areas. The last one is about the advantages, competitive advantages of China scholars. So this is related to one of Lucy's point, why the demand is so high and why the supply is so high. And one thing that is relatively unique to professors in China, especially the business school professors in China, is that most of them, if not all of them, sit on multiple boards of directors, and many of them also sit in government agencies. And this gives them the opportunity to observe how the business is done, and this gives them the connection to the business, and this will give them knowledge about the institutions and practices. And at the same time, this will give them access to proprietary data. So here I will encourage non-US, non-China scholars also to work with the US-China scholars. Hopefully, the two group of authors will contribute to complementary their skills to generate more insightful research. So that will be all from my discussions. So thank you for your attention.
So in the interest of time, and given that I didn't know what SP's first name was until he raised his hand, I'm just going to go ahead and call on SP at this point. You're muted, SP.
SP, you are muted.
Mark, is it possible for me to quickly touch on the?
3 minutes left. We're going to get one question.
Okay.
Okay.
SP, go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you. Sorry for being rude and raising my hand before even the presentations were over. But I have two quick comments or questions. One is that the authors as well as discussants lament the fact that China research is bit in a citation bubble. But do we have a benchmark? I mean, is it really that it is in a bubble, or that is the norm? So it might be worthwhile thinking about it. Maybe China research has influenced other research more than we think, or maybe it is too little, and that might be useful to think about. Second, in a similar vein, China has clearly grown enormously in the last 20, 30 years or 40 years. And that is, some observations are that is despite they have not embraced all the institutions of that West has, or that ones that IMF or others advocate. And the question then becomes is, do we say that these institutions, some of these institutions are not necessary for economic growth? But to me, it seems, what's the counterfactual? You know, what the growth might have been had China had embraced many of these other institutions in addition to some that they embraced and that produced enormous growth. So really, I think we should be clever in terms of crafting a research design that looks at that possibility, that what if some other institutions like enforcement or some others that you have talked about that are somewhat weak in China currently, what if they embrace those rather than saying that some of these institutions do not matter?
Thank you so much, SP. And I want to piggyback on your overall observation about whether China research is in a bubble. Let me just quickly go over a few of these numbers here. China research does draw sites from both non-China studies and also non-accounting studies. And I will now go over these numbers. And to SP's second point, I completely agree with you. The interesting question is whether China has grown because of its sort of alternative institutions or despite its weak institutions. So we don't really know what the counterfactual is. And that is a very keen observation. Now to quickly touch on Another point which I think is very important, and this is, I have to thank the discussants for giving us the opportunity to look at this, their discussion slides ahead of time. We borrow the graph from the discussions presentations where the citation counts are based on total sites. We just want to mention that over 70% of the China studies are published in the last 5 years, since 2016. So when you look at the total citation numbers, it's not surprising that you're going to see some very low numbers. So the apples to apples comparison would be yearly citation counts. So we have numbers that we have reported in the paper, and these are reproduced here. So with that, I go back to the question from the audience.
So Ava, I guess you'll be the last question.
Thanks, Mark. It seems like it's more of a comment than a question, actually. It seems like a lot of the points made today apply equally to sector-specific studies. In most of those sector-specific studies, probably with the exception of banking, you have to either argue the importance from an observability point or from an identification point. So is there an argument that we might need some sector-specific surveys to dig deeper into that, because we tend to just throw in industry fixed effects and sort of throwing in, following up on Steve's point in the chat, what is another demand for our research, or where else can we have impact? It's impacting students. And it seems like our students, particularly MBA students, are interested in how particular issues apply in their sector.
We do see systematically important industries, and there are surveys on the banking industry, for example, just because of its central importance to the entire economy. So I completely agree with you. I see an analogy, a parallel there.
Well, thanks to the authors for an excellent paper, and to Joanna for having an excellent presentation. Also, thanks to the discussants for excellent discussants, and I apologize to Lutzi for cutting him off. Anyway, we'll see you in about 8 minutes for the next session.
Sorry, can everyone see my screen well? Good, okay, thanks.
Yep, everything's fine. Okay, I think we're just about ready to get started here. Was that my right? Just nod your head, Joanna. Are we ready to get started? We're ready to get started. Joanna says we're ready to get started. We're ready to get started. Okay, so this is the final session. Before we get started, I just want to send out a handful of thank yous. Obviously, putting on a virtual conference is a different animal than putting on a live conference, and it requires more of some people, maybe less of others, but it's still a ton of work. And so I want to thank the people that were most involved with putting this conference on. So first, I want to say thanks Sue North. I think many of you received numerous emails from her. She was obviously working very hard, putting a lot of things to grow, informed as to what we were supposed to do and how we were supposed to do it, and everything has run super smoothly. So thank you very much, Sue. I also want to thank the Josh and the Simon School IT team. As you could imagine, a virtual conference requires a lot of work from our IT department. So again, everything has run so smoothly and without a hitch. And so, we thank the Simon IT team for that. And then finally, Joanna Wu has certainly done a tremendous amount of work. So we made a decision fairly early on to move from an in-person to a virtual conference, and Joanna sort of took the ball seamlessly and put things together in a very efficient way. And I think we've had one of our most successful conferences ever. And I think we had great papers, great discussants, great participation. As Mark indicated, hopefully next year we will be back in person. We're all looking forward to that. But without further ado, let me introduce Jinwan. He's going to be talking about how private firm disclosure affects demand for public firm equity, and he'll have 20 minutes, and then Mike Minnis will have 25 minutes, and then we'll open things up to Q&A.
All right, thanks, Wayne, for the introduction. And we'd also first like to thank the editors and organizers for giving us the opportunity to present, Mike for agreeing to discuss, and Mark Lang and Anonymous Referee and many others who've given us a very constructive feedback for making this paper where it is right now. Marcel Ulbert is my co-author in this paper. He'll be sort of managing the chat box if you have any questions. So as the title of this paper suggests, the paper essentially is about how private firm disclosures impact global investors' demand or capital allocation to its public peers. We think this question is important for at least three reasons, related reasons. One is that in our view, research on private firm disclosures in general, and especially in the context of reallocation or externalities that I'll define in a few slides, is relatively scarce. And we think this is an unfortunate feature of the literature given its economic importance. Over 98% of the 40 million firms that disclose some form of financial information globally are in fact private. And relatedly, this area has predominantly been about public firm disclosures, and for good reasons, but we think we can extend our sort of research in this area. And as we pose this question, another observation we made is that there's a general lack of widely applicable empirical proxies that can measure private firm transparency in a global setting. And one of the contributions or intended contributions is to fill that gap by providing a proxy that can be used in other contexts internationally as well, as we'll discuss more in detail. So before I state the formal sort of hypotheses or forces at play when we think about the link between private firm disclosures and public firm equity demand, I'd like to start with two anecdotes that sort of highlight two possibilities. So if I just read this out up here, having access to a private firm's financials offers an advantage. It can give a fund an edge when evaluating its other investments. If you own Google or Microsoft or other competitors in the space, and here other competitors mean other private firms, you'd certainly want to know what's going on with a market niche dominator like then privately held Facebook. This was written in Wall Street Journal 2011, interviewing Russell Kinnell, who is the director of mutual fund research in Morningstar. And as this quote suggests, it sort of highlights the very possibility of how private firm disclosures can play an important role in not only valuing public firms, but other private firms as well, and potentially affect in a meaningful way on how investors can optimize their portfolios across private and public firms. And then we, of course, wondered, and many others wondered in the very early stages of this project, where do investors really allocate or optimize their portfolios across these two asset classes, private and public? And while it may not be always true, this anecdote sort of helps us to that, or points to that possibility, where BlackRock basically sort of surveys their institutional, global institutional clients actually, which is very relevant for our setting, and says the following, or finds the following. BlackRock's December 2018 survey of global institutional clients representing 7 trillion in assets showed a desire to further increase allocations in private markets by specifically actually reducing their allocation to public equities. So this sort of, again, highlights the possibility that given the opportunity to, say, invest in private equities identified through disclosures, it points to the possibility that investors will jointly consider them and even reallocate them if there's the demand for it. So given these two anecdotes, we basically think about two opposing predictions or forces underlying this relation. So the first one is what we call the negative pecuniary externalities, where it basically states that private firm disclosures may reduce or have a negative impact on public firm equity demand. And this is possible if private firm disclosures contain what we call firm-specific or idiosyncratic information specifically about private firms, and which will then cause an equilibrium effect or induce investors to reallocate more towards private firms away from public firms, sort of like how that BlackRock example illustrates. This can operate through basically a reduction in uncertainty of private firms in general, or also what's consistent with our story is that it could increase awareness of what private firm investment opportunities are out there, similar in spirit to, say, the Merton 87 idea, where it increases the investor base and helps investors share risk in a more effective way. On the other side, which might be more familiar to us when we think about these externality or spillover effects, is that there could be positive information externalities where private firm disclosures can, of course, provide useful signals in evaluating public firms and may contain industry-wide information relevant for public firms, in which case it might have a positive demand effect on public equity. As an overview of our results, we find that this first hypothesis, HA, is what we find on average. And this is consistent with two sort of underlying economic forces that we try to articulate. So first is that it seems like for this to hold, on average, again, global investors seem to be cash constrained in the sense of they're not able to respond to private firm investment opportunities with their cash holdings, and they have to liquidate some amount of their public equity holdings. And another piece here is that it seems like, again, on average, private and public equity markets are not segmented in the sense that the BlackRock example have illustrated. Another point I'd like to sort of clarify at this point is that we're not making a statement about how private firm disclosures content is more idiosyncratic or firm specific. We're open to the possibility that both types of information exist in these statements, but rather the empirical average or condition that seems to be underlying these findings is that it sort of makes the first hypothesis, the reallocation effect, dominate on average among global investors. So how we operationalize this requires two things we need to measure. One is, of course, a proxy for transparency around the world for private firms specifically, which we call trans% FS items. And this uses the Orbis data. And one of the key features of this data is that it helps us sort of navigate and compare different financial statement items across the globe. And it standardizes them into 39 buckets of financial statement items. And then we then operationalize this following Chen Miao and Shevlin's sort of intuition at 2015 JAR, where we measure or come up with a measure of private firm transparency based on its granularity by computing the fraction of observable financial statement items divided by the number of 39 basically per firm, the total number of financial statement items they could have disclosed based on this standardized measure. And so, and then we aggregate this at the investee country industry year level. And just to illustrate, for example, in Japan manufacturing in 2013, this value was 89%. And in Germany manufacturing in same year, it was 68%. USA in the same industry, same year was much lower as we might have expected. And we were basically using this measure across country at this level of granularity. And then we need, of course, a measure for global equity demand. And we use this data from Maggiore, Neyman, and Schrager, which was data sort of used in this Journal of Political Economy paper that they graciously make available on their website that basically lets us track equity demand at the investor-investee industry year levels, so investor country and investee country. So for example, we can track US investors' demand for public equity in Japan's versus Germany's manufacturing industry each year, for example. So we then combine this data with the transparency variable we have, which yields a main sample of roughly 73,000 observations spanning from 2005 to 2017, comprised of 19 investors, 46 investee countries, and 10 industries. So then we put all of these together and basically try to link the relationship between the following variables. So our Y variable, again, is equity demand measured at the investor country I, investee J, industry N, E, or T, against 2-year lagged transparency variable following prior research that articulates or argues that it takes roughly 2 years for information to disseminate. And then we have a host of time varying controls and so on. One thing I'd like to sort of highlight here is that the main design here includes the following fixed effect, investor-investee industry fixed effect. So for the same investor, say United States, investing in Japan in a given industry. So it's sort of within that unit of observation, we're exploiting time series variation within holding constant the investor and investee and year fixed effects. And our results are generally robust. In fact, if we use a more cross-sectional identification strategy, but this is our sort of main design. And we also, of course, recognize that the beta 1 here is not to be interpreted causally. And we try to validate this through other difference and differences tests that we'll discuss later. And we're also working on a third test that we couldn't make it to the conference, but we'll maybe have time to discuss later. This was a conscious choice. We sort of wanted to start broad, given our measures, sort of goals of the measures to keep it broad and applicable to a broad cross-section of countries. But we're sort of also trying to fine tune it and make the causal statement also as strong as possible. So before I show you the regression results, I think it's informative to look at the descriptives of our measure a bit. So here we measure our private firm transparency. And in fact, with the same data, we can also measure the public firm's transparency measure. And what's informative here is that not only are the public, as expected perhaps, the transparency of public firms are greater than private firms in a significant way. The standard deviation for public firms is also much lower, which kind of says that public firms are much more transparent on average, but also consistently so around the world. So perhaps this already points to the possibility, in our view, that the incremental informational benefit of private firm disclosures might not be as big for public firms. So which kind of suggests or sets the stage, in our view, why the negative pecuniary externality effect also might dominate. And so consistent with that idea, and as we've overviewed earlier, we find a negative relation between our X variable, transparency variable, with 2-year future log FPI equity. To be more specific, a 1 standard deviation increase in our X leads to roughly a 12% decrease in future public demand for equity for that same investee industry set of public firms. This is, again, robust to alternative fixed effect structures and robustness checks. One thing also notable here is that our estimates are quite stable without control variables, which also, in our view, somewhat alleviates concerns that omitted characteristics are driving all of our results. So that was reassuring. We then kind of dig a little deeper of our transparency measure, and we're able to sort of bucket them into different financial statement types: balance sheet, income statement, which is P&L, and footnote items. And it seems that they are all predictive of future demand for public equity. And this is somewhat consistent with our conversations with private equity investors who say that it's not really one specific type of financial statement item that they look for when they care about or want to project make financial projections. It's sort of the contextual and broader sort of mosaic type of argument where they look for different types of financial statement items, such as revenue, working capital, and number of employees, that are sort of spread across all these different financial statements that are all jointly relevant to them. So with this main set of results we have, of course, one question is, does this decline necessarily imply a reallocation, which is sort of an important narrative of our story, the mechanism. And of course, one is of causality. Although we consciously started broad and somewhat descriptive in nature to keep that broad applicability, can we speak about causality, and to what extent can we? So the next set of analyses will try to address these questions. So as far as reallocation, I'll show you 2 tests. The first one here is, following the intuition mostly from the finance literature, where they try to identify for any given 2 countries the cost or difficulty in which one country has with investing in another. We use 2 proxies, what's called capital control, again, developed mostly by in finance, where it gives you 10 index, basically a country pair index of how difficult it is to invest in one country, and currency appreciation of the investee country, where the intuition here is that if the currency of the investee country goes up, it's more difficult to invest in that country. So conditional on there being more disclosure and perhaps wanting to invest in private equity, they're more likely to reallocate existing capital, namely their public equity, in that same investee industry. And we find, consistent with that sort of intuition from prior research, we find a more intense reallocation when sort of they're constrained, when the investor is constrained in investing new capital. And as perhaps more direct even evidence for that same, again, investee industry, when we see an increase in disclosure of private firms, we specifically find that there's more M&A activity targeting private firms, more VC activity, as well as more private equity activity, in stark contrast to what we document among public equity firms that are peer firms in that same industry, indicating evidence of reallocation. And we also like to share two sort of tests to address certain endogeneity concerns. One is, of course, of reverse causality, and we use this distributed lag model that's often used in economics, where the idea here is basically to plot the or investigate the lead lag relationship between our y variable against our x. So -3 here basically represents the 3-year lag effect of our y variable on x. This is 2 years prior, 1 year prior, and so on. And we basically plot the cumulative sort of effect between these two variables. And we basically see that some amount of reverse causality doesn't seem to be the only thing that's driving our results in the pre-trend here, indicating that the concern here is, of course, if log FPI equity could have been on a trend where it might have continued even without our measure of transparency. And another reassuring feature here is that the significant effect seems to happen 2 years out, again, consistent with the idea of information taking time to disseminate and affect portfolio decisions. And finally, we have two settings, working on a third, but the one we have here is the first one is what we call the BVD office setting, where we basically exploit the idea, speaking to the data vendors, we had the chance to speak to them about this, is that they open offices in certain investee countries, and it represents an expansion of the availability of private firm information to global investors. We admit that the opening of the office, of course, may not be random, but at least conditional on the controls and our fixed effect structures, we do seem to document parallel trends, and the effect sort of takes place afterwards, the negative effect. And we also, as a second setting, we use the business register, for example, following Brewer and Brewer, which is basically the EDGAR equivalent in Europe, where it helps disseminate private firm information in Europe. And of course, then we'll have to scope it down to Europe specifically, and we continue to find something similar as this right plot indicates. So in conclusion, our results that private firm disclosures induce this reallocative effect on public equity demand, we view has at least 3 contributions. One is that it is of setting that, investigating private firm disclosures and public firm outcomes is something relatively underexplored. Another, we think, is conceptual. The idea of this reallocation in general in the disclosure literature, while we're not the first to do it, we view it as something that's underexplored. And one is of measurement. We realize and observe that there's not many proxies out there specifically about private firm transparency in general, and in particular in a global setting, that we'd like to sort of make available and spur future research, hopefully. We recognize, of course, there are certain caveats, what we view as also opportunities. I think we can further work on the causal sort of narrative, where the third setting we're working on is using Bartik IVs, for example, using these simulated scopes that were used, again, specifically about Europe, but we're trying to think about ways to extend that to a broader sort of context. And also, I think we can also do a little bit more kind of related to that point on thinking about the drivers of our sort of measure. We think the exogenous factors such as regulation is an important piece, but we're working on maybe how to quantify that or how to further sort of tease out these other factors such as data coverage and voluntary disclosure effects by the private firms. Finally, our story assumes a static firm. Public firms, private firms, given these phenomena, may sort of respond strategically and may speak to the broader welfare effects, which is interesting considerations perhaps for future research as well. So thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to Mike's discussion. Thank you.
All right. Very good. Thanks, Jinwan. And Mike Minnis, you have 25 minutes.
All right, thanks, Wayne, and thank you to the editors for asking me to do this. I've really enjoyed the last couple of weeks digging into this paper, and my slide's not advancing. There we go. All right. I've had lots of conversations actually with a lot of people over the last couple of weeks here, and it's been very, very helpful, including Ralph and Brent, who are responsible kind of for both the theory and the data, who are fortunately colleagues of mine too. And that's been really helpful to dig into this thing. And as a matter of fact, I found myself over the last couple of weeks digging way down deep into this paper. And I have to really appreciate Anna Costello here, who told me a couple of days ago that I need to remember this is not just for the authors, this is for the audience. And so I kind of had to pull back and do a little 30,000 foot view here. And so I like to think my discussion is both kind of in the clouds and in the weeds. So a little cloudy, a little weedy. And excellent. I'm going to dig into a little bit of data here. And Tom Berry is my research assistant who's done an excellent job. So here's and I think Jin Wan covered the paper pretty well. So what are the spillover effects of financial disclosures on private firms, private firms on public firms? And he talks about these two kind of potentially competing hypotheses. One of them seems like it's a good one, that we're going to reduce information asymmetry. And one of them that they present kind of in a negative light, that it's actually going to suck away capital investment in those public firms. And so that's kind of the high level setting here for it. And so I can remember Mark Bradshaw was discussing a JAE paper a number of years ago. And he said right from the beginning, everybody sitting in the audience, all you want to hear from the discussants, so what do you really think about this paper? Honestly, I don't remember what Mark's answer was about that paper here, but let me kind of at a high level say what I think about this paper. I think it's a tremendous setting. Obviously, you could say I'm biased. I do a lot of work in this area. I think it's revealed preferences to where I think things are important as opposed to bias. There's tremendous amount of interest by both regulators and academics. I'm going to share some papers here that are very new papers in this space. A tremendous growth in terms of capital flowing into this space, as Jin Wan pointed out. And so I think from there's a lot of angles here that are really important. This paper, in terms of its conclusions here, we're going to talk a little bit about what I think about some of their conclusions and the way they make these conclusions, where they conclude that there's these negative pecuniary externalities. What does that conclusion mean and how do they get there? And basically the bottom line and the way I'd sum up this paper is that if this paper were a firm, I'd call it like a VC-backed venture startup here, and that it's potentially very intriguing, but most of the values are kind of the future delivery. And I don't mean that necessarily just from these authors so much as maybe the future literature that can kind of keep building on these ideas, because it's certainly not going to be one paper that's going to solve this problem. So there's lots of stuff I'm going to get into, and admittedly, I'm not going to touch on a lot of the stuff that they do here. I had to focus it on a few things that I wanted to talk about, take the discussant's prerogative here. The paper does a lot of robustness and alternative specifications, some cross-sectional stuff that's really nice, this lead lag stuff. I'm not going to get into a lot of that because I did want to touch on a couple of other things more in more detail here. Just real quick, some slides that PitchBook helped me put together here in terms of there's tremendous growth in the private space here. And you can see the white line is private equity growth relative to venture capital and public equity markets, which the public equity markets on the bottom line. Especially in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been tremendous growth in this space, and a lot of capital has been allocated to that space. Now, you also have to note here that if you look at this chart, it's somewhat misleading in the sense that there's still more dollar growth in terms of market cap and public space. And that's just because it's starting obviously from a much larger base here. But Jin Wan's point previously, there's tremendous flow going into this space. Likewise, there's a lot more recognition of a lot of the research going into this as well. Thinking about the previous paper in kind of the China area, a lot of this work has come in the European setting because that's where we can study a lot more of the private company disclosures here. A lot of these papers are not looking at spillover effects per se, but rather how the required disclosure is affecting those firms and their actions directly. This paper takes the approach of how do private company disclosures affect the public company setting. Okay, so conceptually, these are the two competing hypotheses here. There's a private company disclosure, and that could lead to two different possibilities here: investment into private companies, or simply just generating more information about public companies, and that could lead to two then separate outcomes. Investment out of public companies, or in fact, kind of in some sense, more investment into public companies. depending on what these two mechanisms actually are. And the way they're going to test these two competing hypotheses, or they have these two variables, they have their treatment variable, their outcome variable. I'm going to talk in a bit more detail about how those two are measured in a moment here. But first of all, let's talk a little bit high level about the conceptual point of the mechanisms behind where they're going with this. You know, when I first saw this paper, my very first reaction to this first step here, and again, the first step in the hypothesis that they find support for is this one, that private company disclosure leads to more investment in private companies. My first reaction was disclosure itself doesn't allow for more investment because there still needs to be a liquid market. I can disclose all I want, but I'm not letting you invest into my company. It does, I think one could think a little bit about the search costs associated with private equity funds looking for potential investments. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that particular mechanism, but it would be really interesting to see a little bit more about this first step mechanism and support for this. The paper recognizes this. I think they make this as a caveat here, but I'd really like to see some support for this mechanism. Likewise, the second step too is a little bit of an interesting one too. When you think about redirecting capital out of public markets into private markets, and it also requires you to think a little bit about how the data is constructed here, this GCAP data. And this is my understanding of this data here. So you've got a UK kind of personal investor. This is an individual invests in a UK mutual fund. Notice all of this data that's this GCAP data is mutual funds and ETFs. In principle, most of these funds cannot invest in private companies. They have certain investment restrictions. That's not completely true. And we had Michelle Lowry as a discussing yesterday. Actually, I wish she was here. She actually has a paper. She and I worked together in this conference with the SEC about 5 years ago, where she looked at some mutual funds investing in private companies. But generally speaking, it's relatively limited. And so the way this kind of data works, you've got a UK investor putting money in a mutual fund or an ETF who has some sort of prescribed investment allocation. We're going to talk about some sort of private company disclosure shock. And then what happens here in principle is, I think, behind their mechanism is what has to happen is that this individual investor, because this mutual fund can't invest in private companies directly, really what they have to have in mind here, I think, is the UK investor pulls out of the mutual fund and redirects it to another fund, who then in turn redirects that investment into private company, some sort of manufacturing company. So what they're going to try to measure in the data is how much investment is in a German public company held by a mutual fund here. And then once again, it would be nice to kind of see some more detail about some of those flows rather than just kind of directly measuring this outcome variable to begin with. So first set of thoughts here about the paper. It'd be great to get more idea. You know, we talked a lot yesterday. I'm gonna bring up some more thoughts about yesterday too, about, you know, kind of causal identification or whatever else. And I think this is going to be one of these papers where nailing something down isn't going to be super easy to do. But if you can put the pieces of the puzzle together through the mechanisms, I think that would help a lot. The second point here is this inelastic markets hypothesis. I don't have much time to talk about that here, but the basic idea behind this is that there's a limited capital pool. And as a result of the limited capital pool, you could actually see the effects that they're talking about. And I think this could be built up in the paper a little bit more instead of just basically a footnote now as to how these flows actually work and why why this negative pecuniary externality could actually come about. And then I'm going to skip the last point here. That's more for the authors. So, but I did want to go to this negative pecuniary externalities, and I have to admit too here. So, and this is Anna said to me, why do we care about this, Mike? And I thought that's a good question. And I started looking at this, and I was like, negative pecuniary externality, and they're abstract. And my first thought was, golly, this is like something I need to go see my doctor about. I know what each of those words means, but the phrase itself, I needed to put together. Of course, where do you go for that? I go to Wikipedia. And what's interesting about a negative pecuniary externality is it's not necessarily a welfare destroying issue to begin with. And so It's really just about the fact that within a market, when somebody demands more of something, that means somebody else gets less of it. And we could still have Pareto efficient outcomes here. And therefore, it's not really a welfare concerning issue. And kind of the way I thought about this is you kind of think about wine. I've never used this before, but I know there's some people on this call that use this Zacky's to purchase wine. And let's say Nimitz likes, for example, I see a Billicart salmon, whatever this is, wine. He was going to bid $800 for this. But of course, there's always a bigger fish out there. And you've got somebody like Wayne who comes along and bids $1,000 for this. Well, Wayne just created a negative pecuniary externality to Nimitz, but I don't think anybody's going to really care about that. And I don't think we're in a Pareto efficient outcome or in any less of an efficient outcome here because of that. And that's what you can kind of think of Wayne being the private firms here and Nimitz being the public firms. Of course, the issue with negative pecuniary externalities, if you have somebody like SP who comes in and just buys the entire market and doesn't allow any of us to have wine, but that's not what's going on in this story here. So stepping back conceptually here before I get into a couple more details, if the results are correct of this paper, are we just talking about a reallocation of capital? And I think that might be interesting to document for sure. Still, I do think this idea that as I read the paper, it almost felt like a negative outcome here, when I think actually being able to redirect capital to all different places in the economy might actually be a good thing here. Okay. Several other kind of high level comments here, and some of this may be coming out in chat and Q&A later too, but let's get into some weeds here, because I actually had a lot of fun with thinking about some of the data and what we're actually looking at. So here is some, think about this from a treatment variable, an outcome variable, and the specification of the paper. So the treatment variable, I didn't replicate this, so I don't have as much fun to have with this one here. I think it's interesting. I think this is actually a kind of a neat contribution here to think about, but it does have some shortcomings. So first of all, the important point here is this is kind of an intensive margin measure. In other words, the N that they're looking at here is conditional on disclosing at least one financial statement line item in this Bureau van Dijk data set. How much do you actually disclose? So it's really important that a firm has to disclose something here. And I think that kind of issue leads to kind of three things that I'm a little bit concerned about here in thinking about this particular measure. The first biggest issue here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this more in a second when I think about the outcome variable, and this is underlying a lot of the papers when you think about causation, for example, is what's causing the underlying variation in this treatment variable. And here's the statement that they have in the paper is we're interested in factors beyond regulatory reporting mandates in the global equity market. And I'm not quite sure what that is. And I think if the authors kind of nailed this down and better define that for me, that would be extremely helpful. And I also wasn't sure, again, to Jinwan's point, I really like this too. They're adding this measure to the literature, but they also say we're going to contrast this with the prior literature as to why we're looking at this in the way we're looking. But I thought the primary contrast with the prior literature was thinking about the spillovers and not these measurement constructs. So we're kind of turning two dials, both kind of the outcome that we're interested in and the way we're measuring it. And maybe that's good, but it leads a couple of questions to me. And then this intensive margin item as well goes to that first mechanism. If the primary mechanism we're after here is search cost for PE funds as what's driving this, then the extensive margin, I think, in other words, what portion of the firms in the economy are actually disclosing might be a more potent treatment variable to look at here than this intensive margin kind of variable. But potentially, it's worth looking at both of them, but I would certainly want to bring perhaps that extensive margin item in here as well. Third item, I'm leaving for the authors here as well, and I'll talk about that. I kind of talked a lot about these suggestions to begin with here. One of them that I did want to pull up is this economic magnitude idea. I do think it's important here to think a little bit about economic magnitudes. But one thing that the authors need to consider here is that when they look at the pooled distribution of their treatment variable, that overstates the amount of true variation I think that they have, given that they're actually looking within, this is a within specification with their fixed effects. And that standard deviation is going to be much, much smaller. That variation is going to be much, much smaller. And as a result, so is their economic magnitude. And I'll show you what I mean about that. One last point here, very important point, I think. I would drop US as an investee country. I can't think of any reason why private companies in the US, the variation there is changing for exogenous reasons, other than we could have more disclosure because more private equity is pouring in there, but that feels awful endogenous to me. And I know no reason for the US as an investee country to kind of think about that disclosure here as just one thought. Okay, so here's this data. This was new to me. This could open the box for, I think, more accounting research, so it's worth a little bit more of a deep dive. This is that website, the Global Capital Allocation Project, started by Brent and others. He was really excited to hear about accountants doing some work in this. It captures the holdings of mutual funds and ETFs. And my understanding from Ralph is this represents probably about 20–25% of the overall public equity holdings of the market. So it's a non-trivial portion of the holdings here. And so I, of course, had this data and I thought in an RP I'm paying, so let's noodle with the data a little bit. And so this was my replication of table 1. I got very, very close here off in this right-hand column here. So I was able to find their descriptive statistics by investor, investor country. But here's what's interesting about this is that when you look at who they're investing in, most of the investment is actually domestic. And in matter of fact, the #1 largest cell in the data set is US mutual funds and ETFs investing in US public markets. And as a matter of fact, of the $16.7 trillion in here, $10.7 trillion of it is invested in the US. And then, $10.5 trillion of it is on the diagonal. So it's all domestic investment of that $10.5 trillion. Is domestic investment. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a problem for their story per se, as whether it's foreign holders or not. I did find it interesting that their outcome variable is labeled foreign public investment because a lot of it actually is coming through domestic holdings here. So there's kind of 4 issues or thoughts I had about this. I think it's cool data to actually think about and use here. But domestic is the overwhelming majority of total investment dollars here. Again, may not be a problem because I think they should have flows with respect to private company disclosures as well, just as well as foreign could. You might want to think about that with respect to their cross-sectional tests that they do, but I don't think that's a problem per se. The US part of it here is this massive kind of big elephant in the room, I think, that one of the things to think about here is whether we should have weighted regressions based on the amount of dollar amount, and all of a sudden the US blows up in terms of importance here in this setting if you had weighted and instead of just simple average regressions. The other point I'd want to make, and this does actually have some impact, and the authors run a robustness test on this, is that there's a lot of zeros here between investor and investee countries. And I really kind of wonder about whether or not we want those zeros in here, because if there's really no investment ever going in between 2 countries, then there's really no scope for response here. And we might be worried about a lack of identifying a treatment there to begin with. And as a matter of fact, we see some evidence of some attenuation in their outcome coefficient when they actually drop those zeros. And so I think that that's something that they should be considering. Okay, so this relates back to, and I decided to do a little deep dive, especially given the conversation yesterday with the Armstrong et al. Paper with Dan's presentation. What is the variable? What is the variation that they're using? So let's talk about fixed effects. I think Salt and Peppa had a song about this in the 90s, although I don't think it was fixed effects. I think they're talking about something else. But so there's variation. Here's the variation. And as a point of reference here, this little dot is one of their units of observation in their study. And I've picked USA into Japan and USA into Germany. And what you see here, if you plot this, what you see is the following. One, like you see some variation associated with the crisis. You see some upward trends. You see that there's variation across industries within this pair. You see that there's variation that's consistent within the USA going into Germany versus Japan. So you see some variation going across these as well that's consistent or correlated. And so, this is the raw outcome variable. And again, we could think about different pairings of countries and industries as well. But then here's the trick. Here's what's going on here is they regress these on their fixed effects, and they use investor investee industry fixed effects along with the year fixed effects. And here's what we see. What happens is that we're doing this within investor investee industry. So each of these cells now is going to be mean zero because we're extracting the variation out at this level. And what happens is all their variation, as Jin-Wan indicated, is over time. Well, this is where I get a little bit concerned about this and thinking about the fixed effect structure, is that this is precisely the variation the prior literature, and I think about some of Matthias's papers, is very worried about because of the following. Things like trends are not getting sucked out of here. And those trends could be consistent with what's also going on in the public markets. In other words, what they try to identify, they being Matthias and co-authors, try to identify is all on the cross-sectional variation within this grouping, not within this particular cell over time. So the fixed effects kind of matter in this sense. And so what am I worried about? I'm worried about trends, and that the fact that these fixed effects are not specifying or not pulling out the omitted variable that I'm most concerned about, which is the overtime changes in driving both the treatment and the outcome variable, and then common shocks with the standard errors. This reveals to me also that I think that they need to revisit what they're doing with their standard errors, because there's correlation, residual correlation here across these units that I think needs to be addressed. In fairness to the paper, here's an interesting thing. They do in table 8 a robustness check where they do an alternative fixed effect specification here, but you'll notice here that they're highly correlated. The residuals between those two sets of outcomes are very, very correlated, because it's fundamentally not getting to the same fixed effect structure that's allowing for that variation that I might be concerned with to remove. And so I had my RP do an alternative specification where I think this is going to help, and I'm still not satisfied with this, but investor investee year fixed effects. Now, what happens here is my blue line is mean zero within this grouping, a 3x3 grid of USA into Japan, and mitigates to an extent some of that temporal variation I'm more concerned about, and identifies off the cross-sectional variation across industries here. And the reason that that's important, I'll let you go read Matthias's paper as to why one might be concerned about that. But here's the takeaway that I think about, we think about yesterday's conversation as well. I'd like the authors to specify what variation they're most concerned about and set up a fixed effect structure that addresses that to the best that they can. And I think, to me, this is this time series change that I'm worried about. And it may not be what I've been referring to over the last week, this kind of fixed effects hokey pokey, where we kind of put them in and take them out and see that it's robust. I'd rather actually like get to what we think is the right specification and put that in here and really kind of look at the details here to see what variation we're using. And I think we can get there. I think there's some cool opportunities to do that. Okay, let me kind of, I think that's it for me. So let me get to my conclusions here. Oh, one more thing. This BVD office openings, I'm a little concerned about that one. I think that's going to be endogenously related to where investors want to go. I think it's great that the authors are doing this, but I think that electronic business register is the one I'd like to push. Okay, great. Important research, an interesting research question. I think it's going to contribute to this burgeoning literature of how public and private markets interact with one another. Lots of robustness, lots of caveats in this paper, but I think we can do several steps here that can really nail down both what we think about the treatment, what we're thinking about the outcome, to get us a little closer to some better sense of what's actually the mechanisms going on behind this. So great, I really appreciate this. It's been a lot of fun thinking about this paper.
Okay, well, thanks, Mike. So great presentation, great discussion. And so now we'll take some Q&A. I already see the hands sort of lining up. So it looks like we've got a lot of questioners. And I would just ask, let's try to keep it relatively efficient. So ideally the question should not be longer than the answer. And, nobody wants to hear the question start with, I've got 3 questions that are related and 1 unrelated comment. That's not what we're looking for. So pick your best one and let it rip as quickly as possible. So Phil Berger, you are up first.
Thanks, Wayne. Very interesting paper. The highest level comment I think I have is the following. I think it is really hard to make some of the spillover conclusions that you may want to make here. And just let me give you one example, which maybe is a small one, but take the take the paper that Rodrigo has with Gilles Hillary and Gary Biddle, where what they're looking at, so let me accept all your results at face value. And then just say, if I accept all your results at face value, what would it mean? So for example, let's say that what's going on is that there are some public firms, maybe on average, public firms are over-investing, not under-investing. They don't need more capital, so it would be possible that if you did what Rodrigo did in his paper, if you categorized firms as over-investors and under-investors, it would be possible that what's going on is a reallocation related to investment efficiency, which is perfectly sensible. So I just think it's tough to make some of these, and I think this is related to Mike's point, it's tough to make some of these overall welfare spillover claims that you want to make. And I don't want to, I agree with Wayne, I don't want to get too multi-part here, but just one other quick thing. Because I was the editor on the Chen, Miao, and Shevlin paper, I really think you need to do the following if you want other people to use your measure. So it may not be a big concern for you, but I think it's a huge concern with this type of measure if you want others to use it. You've got controls and fixed effects and so on that may help, but those 39 buckets, and I think this is a point Mike was probably going to get to that he didn't in one of his slides, but those 39 buckets are not really feasible for every firm or every industry country even. There are going to be times where you simply couldn't make that disclosure because it doesn't apply to you. So I think you need to talk about that at least a little bit, if not for your paper, for other people to use the measure. So those are, I apologize, but those are my 2 comments.
Thanks so much, Phil. Those are great comments. If I may kind of comment back very briefly, the point on welfare, it's very well taken. And I think Mike really nicely sort of laid it out. Maybe it was also Anna Costello's comment where, when we say pecuniary externalities, it's more of us shying away a little bit on trying to say that it's really a capital reallocation and we can't really further speak to whether this is welfare enhancing or not. And I really liked your kind of thought process about how we can even, rope in Rodrigo's paper, where if we can somehow measure like overinvestment, underinvestment, maybe that also will be an opportunity to us to speak whether this allocation is efficient or not. Something that sort of crossed our minds and maybe we can work more on for sure. The point on the measure, yeah, that's a good point. One of the things I think and we'll have to think about this a little more, is that these, if I may kind of rephrase, I think you're highlighting some sort of like coverage issue. Is that right? Like certain countries?
Well, it's not really so much coverage. I just think that you're not at the firm level. You're at more the country industry aggregation level, yeah. And you've got controls. But for other researchers, if they looked at an individual firm, some firms couldn't possibly disclose in bucket 37 because bucket 37 doesn't apply to their underlying economic activities at all.
I see. No, that's definitely a fair point. And we don't have that discussion in the paper, as you said. Maybe we can sort of flesh that out to make the as a sort of a caution for people who want to use our measure. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Matthias?
Hi, Jinwon. Great presentation. Unfortunately, also 2 points, but I'll try to keep it short. First one on the first stage that Mike was talking about, in terms of showing what happens to the private firms themselves. I think their literature can help you because you have like Casper's paper on the M&As, you have in my job market paper, I'm showing some evidence that the more you have of this type of private firm disclosure, the more you have dispersed ownership, etc. So all of that speaks into the direction that it seems to get more liquid for the private firms there. And then what you're saying is, okay, if we're now looking at the aggregate and to another segment, well, they get sucked somewhere the capital has to come from, and you're showing one way where that's coming from. So that's where one piece of the literature can help you. And I think the other piece with the literature that would be nice to bring in here is precisely on answering these questions on the so what, because there was a lot of questioning about, okay, is this efficient, what's happening, etc. And there, it may help in a later discussion to bring in the papers that look at the aggregate effect, where the treatment is similar to yours, where it's how many private firms or how much do private firms disclose, but then we're looking not just at public or private firms, but we're looking at all the firms. And that's kind of in my job market paper and in the follow-up paper with Christian and the follow-up paper with my sister. We're consistently seeing that, at least in terms of aggregate economic activity and capital formation, there's not much going on net, and if anything, it's slightly negative. So that would suggest that that it's not necessarily all getting better. And then you're saying, look, we're looking within that sliver, within the country, and just looking from one segment to another. So I'm completely, I think this makes a lot of sense what you're showing there. If one segment gets cheaper, then in relative terms, you're shifting more there. But on the aggregate for that, you may be able to pull in the other papers and then kind of complement this way and provide a clearer discussion on what we can infer from this or not.
Yeah, well, that's a great set of comments. By the way, Marcel is, I think, hopefully taking notes of all of these. We'll definitely look at, we are currently benchmarking a lot on your papers. Yeah, and we agree. We would love to push more on sort of that like welfare and sort of, who cares element of who's hurting, who's benefiting type of argument for sure. And we'll definitely try to benchmark some of your findings as well. The challenge, of course, inherently is that it's not as easy to sort of measure the private firm performance, but what we've been kind of on the whiteboard kind of thinking about was maybe we can think a little bit more about, and Mike kind of discussed this, is at least among public firms, we can also see sort of how their subsequent performance plays out. If this is somewhat of a, perhaps if we can at least state that this is somewhat of a negative effect of public firms, for example, we can kind of flesh that out using public firm stock market outcomes or so on. So we'll definitely look at your work for sure. And thanks for these set of comments.
Okay. Ximen?
Yeah, Juan, how are you?
Good,
I have two questions. One question is
just one question. One question would be best.
one question is about the growth. It might represent the potential correlated and omitted variables. So one kind of a suggestion is to look at the public firms in the pre-change period. How do they grow differentially from the private counterparts, as well as looking at the exposed, right? So the exposed capture the differentials and the pre-capture the growth differentials. So this pre-trend analysis could help you to gauge whether that reallocation of the capital is more efficient or it is particularly driven by the disclosure per se.
Yeah, thanks again. All these are so great suggestions. That was definitely, you're highlighting like a first order concern that we had from the get-go. And we try to add controls that try to pick up these growth, industry performance among public firms and number of public firms. We include those controls, but I like your suggestion. We didn't do that, where we can perhaps explicitly maybe like show the trends in public firm growth. And I'll have to think about how that exactly ties into helping us kind of make a welfare statement, as you said, but for sure, that's a great suggestion that we can look at public firms explicitly, their growth trajectories pre versus post, if I'm understanding your point correctly. Yeah, thanks.
Ed DeHaan.
Jinwan, great paper. I think foreign investment is super interesting to look at, but just at a high theory level, when I was reading the paper, I was trying to understand, would these theories apply equally to domestic investment? That you expect the same substitution?
Great point. And I wanted to address that point as well, where yes, number one, we think the underlying theory would be similar across domestic and foreign. If I had to venture a guess, I think it's stronger among foreign due to the fact that there's more informational problems. I think when it's international and when it's domestic, perhaps those problems are less pronounced. So I think our story is best suited when it's foreign. However, I think the underlying economic forces, of course, are similar. As Mike pointed out, and Marcel and I recognize this, I think the Y variable, we call it FPI. I think it should be global sort of portfolio investment. Mike was very gracious to sort of share his slides earlier, so we did run a few tests. That doesn't seem to matter, but you're right. Theoretically, it should hold for both, and we indeed find it to be slightly stronger among foreign. So.
Yeah, I think that's just an interesting extra angle to bring into the paper about that within firm information friction, or within country.
Within country, yeah. Thank you. That's a great point. Thank you.
Frank?
So I trust your results, but with a different interpretation. The negative correlation between private and public firm investment is not because investors are cash constrained, but for risk control purposes. Investors typically have a cap on how much capital to be invested in a given country or a given industry. By investing in private companies, an investor would exist its investment when these companies go public. So that introduces a negative correlation.
I see. So, sorry, so just to make sure I understand, you're saying it's not really that they're cash constraints or that they're necessarily responding to private equity investments by liquidating public, but it's sort of they're trying to optimize their risk across these two asset classes?
They want to control risk. Risk is very important for investors. They don't want to have too much exposure to one country or one industry.
Yes. I'm trying to think whether... No, that's a fair point. I mean, I think that's kind of still somewhat consistent. Maybe, as you said, we can rope that consideration in as well. However, I think that is still consistent with our story, where we are operating under this sort of conceptual idea that, again, investors are trying to jointly optimize across these two asset classes as you described. I think, as you said, maybe even absent their cash constraintness, they would still do this. So that's an interesting point. That's maybe even a third force that we did not explicitly spell out, but I think it's still consistent with the view that we have right now. Investors are jointly optimizing public and private equities, if that helps. Yeah.
Clive?
Interesting paper. I enjoyed reading it. So my question is about the treatment variable. And particularly when I look at table 1B and I look at which countries are the most transparent in terms of private firms and which are less transparent. So what's important to bear in mind is that what your measure is picking up, as Michael said, is the firms that you already have some information on, right? The firms that actually do provide financials. But if you look at countries like, say, the UK, for example, every single private company in the UK discloses financials, right? And then you compare that to other countries like, say, China, where there's very limited numbers of private companies that are providing these financial information. So, you know, when I look at the ranking in table 1B, it just doesn't, for me, it just doesn't pass the smell test. You know, Cayman Islands #2 in terms of transparency, Hong Kong near the bottom, despite the fact that every private firm in Hong Kong provides financial statements. And so I'm just wondering whether some of these countries like the UK, Hong Kong are getting low rankings because, as Phil mentioned, you know, they're so small that then they don't actually need to provide 39 financial statement items.
Well, great point, Clive, thanks. So what we suspect is happening here is really due to Orbis's coverage. And we're kind of embracing that as a measure because the operating assumption here is that, you know, to the extent that this is representative of what investors have as an information set when they make investment decisions. And we had the opportunity to kind of interview the data vendors, and we're convinced that this is a representative sort of set of information that investors have. So it's really driven by Orbis's coverage, and in which, again, to us, it's not so much a matter of whether it represents sort of the amount of disclosure that actually happens in the country, but what information is available for investors. And that's probably what's driving these, but something I guess we can look into further as well. But that was sort of our thought process. But...
Okay, Jeremy?
Yeah, so this might be related to something Shimin just dropped in chat a minute ago, but I was wondering if you could comment on the role that perhaps regulation is playing in this and potentially making staying private be more attractive over time? So, and I know you have an international setting, but in the US, which I'm most familiar with, we have things like the Jobs Act making it possible for companies to advertise their private offerings. So the drop on the ban of general solicitation, raising a number of shareholders that you can have, more recently, a broadening of the definition of an accredited investor. So it seems like that calculus and deciding whether to just stay private or go public might be changing. And it seems like with potentially more dispersed private investment available and maybe more opportunities for private investment, maybe disclosure being a reaction to that.
No, that's a great point. So I apologize. I haven't fully followed Shuman's chat box comment, but
not that I would expect you to.
Yeah, but we kind of had this discussion about like how would the decision to go public sort of affect our results, and it's something. Again, the quick empirical answer is we try to control for that, but what we also kind of conceptually thought, again, kind of some of the papers that Mike also cites, Agamola and Thacker and a few others, I think Matthias has some implications of his work as well. Here's that, like, our concern here was that if there's an exogenous increase in private firm disclosures, that would sort of help or encourage private firms to go public, because staying private is costlier. And in our view, that would have kind of generated a positive correlation between private firm disclosures and public firm equity. And we're finding sort of a negative effect. So that was sort of how we tried to think about it and somewhat discuss even in our paper. But that's sort of how we think about it. But definitely we can also think about this public-private market, I guess, in a more general context as well. So yeah, thanks.
Sugata.
Hey, Jinwan, this comment is motivated by something Ed said and your response. So, when you think about how things might differ with foreign funds, one thing that might happen or one thing that would be nice to think about it is what are the underlying forces that push foreign funds towards public versus private investments in general, right? And one big factor is that regulatory forces, restrictions on ownership, public scrutiny of foreign ownership, they tend to hit public firms first. And so there might be a natural tendency for foreign funds to want to expand their investments first through the private firm channel before they start hitting public firms. And the reason this is important for you is that when you think about private firm disclosures increasing the overall information environment, given the underlying forces, that might actually cause a net shift into private firm investments from foreign funds rather than public funds. So I don't see that prediction being as clear in terms of differentiating from the private firm idiosyncratic disclosures.
I see, great point. So in your story, just to make sure I understand, the sort of economic forces would be different among domestic funds when you say public funds, right? Like, so that they wouldn't shift necessarily to private.
So I don't know if I may have got my words mixed in there. What I'm saying is foreign funds investing in public versus private companies in foreign countries, right? So that's the idea.
I see. Yeah, thank you. Point well taken.
Henry?
A really neat paper, and the discussion is also really interesting to hear. So it seems like there's an implicit assumption that when private disclosure increases, that narrows the gap between private and public disclosure. And I was just wondering if there are settings where that's not the case. Like often when you have FASB regulations, they'll do, or standard setting or SEC regulations, they'll change something for public firms, and then they'll also do something at the private firm level or for small and medium enterprises. So I was basically wondering, and I know you control for public firm number of disclosures, but I'm curious how descriptive the implicit assumption of narrowing the gap when private company disclosures increase, how descriptive that is, especially if you think about what's driving the increase in private company disclosure, which was brought up by several people previously.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right that the implicit assumption underlying our story is that it's as you well put it, sort of narrowing the gap. Yeah, that's maybe an empirical test we can also think about, where you would expect sort of this reallocative effect to be stronger when the quality of disclosure among public firms is very good, and whereas if the public firm disclosure environment in a certain industry or country is lower, maybe that second force, the informational benefit of private firms to public firms, will dominate. So that dynamic is definitely something underlying our story. Conceptually, maybe something we can also think about how to do it empirically as well. So point well, thanks for that point.
Nemeth, are you trying to outbid me?
Yeah, and I have 3 questions and 1 unrelated comment, since we have so much time.
All right, you go ahead and try that. See how far you get.
Agent Ron, so I was hoping you could speak a little bit about the result in table 1 and table 3. So in table 1, you look at the determinants of your transparency proxy, and the results suggest that the foreign portfolio investments is not associated in period T. Foreign portfolio investments is not associated with next period transparency, private firm transparency. And then in table 3, you see a strong negative relation, right? When you reverse this, find that period T disclosure is negatively associated with foreign portfolio investments. I mean, given how that there's some stickiness in both variables, these two results seem puzzling to me. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, just so we're on the same page, thanks for the comment, Emmett. So the table 1D is basically, as you might have picked up, is different time. It's perhaps poor labeling here, but in table 1D, log FPI equity is lagged, and then relative to our measurement of our X, transparency. And then we sort of, in table 3, we see the log FPI equity respond 2 years out. So it's consistent with that sort of, number one, why we do this is sort of as the distributed lag plot show, we wanted to establish that it's not some pre-trend in FPI equity that leads prior to the measurement of treatment. And as you said, there's stickiness. So the response here seems to sort of take place in the future as well. So that's sort of how we're tying it. Maybe the labeling here and the time notation here isn't clear. So if that helps.
Go ahead, Nemeth. Did you have your second question you're going to try to get out, or is this a follow-up?
It's just the same thing. Because the variables are sticky, I would have thought that if you switch the lead lag, the things you'd still probably find a relation, right, between the Y and the X in this case. So that's why the absence of a relation just based on the change in lead and lag is at least was somewhat surprising to me for what it's worth.
Yeah. Okay. We'll think about it. Well, yeah. Thanks, Nemeth. So I think the way we think about it is if we can attribute the change in X as, let's say, just for the sake of argument, purely driven by some regulatory shock, we would hope that it's not related to lagged FPI, and then it's only associated with future FPI. So that's sort of what we have here, and what we try to sort of illustrate with table 1D versus table, I think, 3A. So that's kind of what we're trying to show here. That helps. Okay, thanks.
Charles?
Okay, I was originally just going to send the note to Jingwan personally, but it occurred to me that maybe the conversation would generate more questions and answers. So the one thing that I was curious about is sort of the flow from private to public at the industry country level. So one way to measure that, for example, is like IPOs, right? So, or the flows that you're, so one of your variables is a disclosure variable, the other variable is a flow variable. These two markets do have a way people graduate and, go from private to public. So to what extent, that's something I think you can get a hold of, right? So to what extent would that affect sort of the investments? I mean, just the supply of public firms, and because basically you go from private to public, and when you think about companies, for example, like Facebook, which is sort of out there, they stayed at private for a long time. When they flip, does it do anything to your main variables?
So thanks, Charles. So just so I understand, I think your question is what happens to our variables, I guess both X and Y, when a private firm goes public? Is that fair?
Yes.
Description
Yes.
of what you're saying? Okay. For our Y variable, the equity demand, we would think it would, I mean, this is not tested, so definitely something very interesting we can I think, actually explicitly test, is that our FPI variable would go up for sure, I think, because there's now one more public firm who's receiving public funds. Now, what's interesting though is that whether our data, as sort of Mike nicely summarizes, mostly mutual fund investment, there's some ETFs, but it's mostly mutual funds. Whether they pick up these new IPO firms, it's less clear, so we can test that.
Well, actually, you know, a lot of them, they have to pick up the new IPO firms because you walk in and you're almost index or evaluated, and some of these are huge.
Yeah, no, so that's why we thought there would be sort of a mechanical positive correlation, if anything, between our private transparency variable and amount of FPI, actually, because if they do, then, and again, we're just kind of, I know this idea has been out there, but Agamola and Thacker JAR paper, for example, shows that when private firm disclosure goes up, firms are more likely to go public, private firms, because it's costly to stay private. And if they do, we would sort of see a positive correlation between private firm transparency and mutual funds, as you said, picking it up in the data. So we're finding a negative effect, but I like your point about maybe we can explicitly flesh out what happens to our Y variable among the instances where there's IPO activity. So that's, I like that. Thanks.
All right. Well, that was great. Thanks for, again, a great presentation, great discussion, as well as great questions from all of you folks. We've come to an end here. I want to thank everyone for their participation and their attention. I know, at least speaking from my own experience, it can be challenging to sort of stay alert for a day and a half of online sort of Zoom presentations. So, you know, I was just scrolling forward. We've still got, 100+ people that have their screens on, are paying attention, or at least look like they're paying attention. So, we couldn't do this without all of you folks, all the authors, all the discussants, and all of the participants in the questions. So thanks again for a great conference. Again, hopefully in the new year, we'll all be, sort of toasting in person and getting back to normal. So everybody stay healthy and safe, and thanks again.